Martha Blake didn't say goodbye. She didn't even slow the wagon down. She grabbed Clara by the wrist, dragged her to the edge of the moving wagon board, and shoved hard. Clara hit the ground and rolled, gasping, her palms tearing open against the gravel. Then, Emily. Then little Henry, thrown out like unwanted cargo into the cold Wyoming dark. The bread loaf came last, hurled without a single word. When Clara raised her bleeding face from the dust, all she could see were the wagon wheels rolling away and the back of a woman who had never once called them her own. If this story moved something inside you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that night on the trail and find out how 3 small children survived what no child should ever have to face. The wagon was already 50 yards gone before Clara could breathe again. She lay flat on her stomach in the dirt of the Oregon Trail, her cheek pressed into the cold ground, her lungs refusing to work properly. Somewhere behind her, she could hear Emily crying, that quiet, awful kind of crying that 6-year-olds do when they are too frightened to make real noise. And she could hear Henry saying her name over and over in a voice that was trying very hard not to shake. Clara, Clara, Clara. She pushed herself up onto her hands. Her palms were bleeding. She could feel the sting of it, sharp and real, and somehow that pain was the thing that brought everything back into focus. She was on the ground. The wagon was gone. The children were here. "I'm up," she said. "Henry, I'm up. Stop saying my name like that." "I thought you was dead." "I'm not dead." "Your hands are bleeding." "I know they are." She got to her feet. The prairie stretched out around them in every direction, enormous and indifferent, the sky overhead deepening from purple into black as the last light drained out of the western horizon. She turned in a full circle. There was no wagon. There was no road marker. There was no farmhouse light, no campfire glow, nothing that belonged to a human being except for the 3 of them standing in the dirt. Emily had wrapped herself around Henry's arm and was crying silently into his shoulder. Henry, 5 years old and carrying a half loaf of bread under one arm, like it was the most important thing in the world, was watching Clara with enormous eyes. "She ain't coming back, is she?" he said. It was not a question. Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about lying. She thought about saying what a grown person might say, that there had been a mistake, that Martha would turn the wagon around, that it would all be sorted out before morning. She thought about the look on Martha Blake's face in those final seconds before the shove, not angry, not guilty, not even satisfied, just blank, like throwing them off the wagon was no different from tossing out a worn-out boot. "No," Clara said. "She ain't." Emily made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "Don't," Clara said, and her voice came out harder than she meant it to. She softened it immediately. "Emily, don't. We can't fall apart right now. Do you hear me? We fall apart later, not right now." "When is later?" Emily whispered. "When we're safe." "When will we be safe?" Clara didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the road, 2 ruts pressed into the earth by 1,000 wagon wheels before theirs. And she looked at the bread under Henry's arm, and she looked at the small wool blanket Emily was clutching against her chest. She looked at the rag doll dangling from Emily's other hand, the one that had belonged to their real mother, the one they'd carried all the way from Missouri without losing it once. "We got the bread," she said. "We got the blanket. We got each other. That's more than nothing." "That ain't much," Henry said. "No," she agreed. "It ain't much, but it's ours." She took a breath, straightened up, and made herself think. The wagon had been heading northwest. The trail ran northeast to southwest along this stretch she knew, because she'd been watching the sun the way their father had taught her. Always know where the sun sets, Clara. That's your compass when you got nothing else. Their father. She pushed that thought down hard before it could open up into something she couldn't close again. "We walk," she said. "Walk where?" Henry asked. "Along the trail. Somebody's got to come through here. Wagon trains, riders, somebody. We stay on the trail and we walk until we find somebody." "It's dark." "I know it's dark. There's coyotes out here." "I know there are." Clara. Henry. She turned to look at him directly. He was 5 years old, and he was small for his age, and his face in the dim light looked so much like their father's face that it made her chest hurt. I know it all. I know everything you're about to say, and I know it's true. But there ain't another choice. So we walk. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. He shifted the bread under his arm, reached out, and took Emily's hand, and they started walking. The dark came fully down within the hour. It wasn't the kind of dark that city people might imagine, thick and pressing and full of strange sounds, though it was all of those things. It was also vast in a way that nothing in their experience had prepared them for. The sky above the Wyoming prairie was a dome of black velvet pinned with more stars than seemed possible, beautiful and cold, and utterly without mercy. The wind moved across the grass in long rolling waves. Somewhere far off, a coyote called, and Emily pressed herself against Clara's side so hard that Clara nearly lost her footing. "It's far away," Clara said. "How do you know?" "Because we can still hear ourselves think." They had been walking for what felt like 2 hours, though Clara had no real way to measure it. Her feet were sore. Emily had stopped crying, but her breathing was still ragged, catching every few minutes in a small, involuntary hitch. Henry had eaten a piece of the bread and offered pieces to both his sisters, and they had accepted without argument, because there was nothing to argue about. You didn't waste energy on pride when you were walking in the dark in Wyoming with nothing but a blanket and half a loaf of bread between you and the cold. "Tell me something," Emily said suddenly out of the darkness. "Tell you what?" Clara asked. "Tell me something good, something true." Clara thought about it while they walked. The stars moved overhead. The coyote called again, different direction this time, and she noted it without saying anything. "Papa's boots," she said finally. Emily turned her head. "What?" "Papa's boots. Remember how he used to stomp them on the porch every morning? 3 times, always exactly 3 before he came in for breakfast. Remember that?" A small silence. Then very quietly, "Yeah." "And he used to say, what did he used to say? He'd say, 3 stomps for 3 children and 1 kick for the dirt that don't deserve my company." Clara smiled a little, even though nobody could see it. He thought that was real funny. "It was kind of funny," Henry said from Emily's other side. "It was not funny," Emily said, but she almost laughed saying it. "It wasn't funny," Clara agreed. "But he was." They walked on. The memory of their father settled around them like something warm. James Calloway had been a big man, broad-shouldered and slow to anger, with hands that were rough from work and eyes that were soft when he looked at his children. He had married Martha Blake 14 months after their mother's fever, because he said 3 children needed 2 parents because the trail was hard and the work was harder because he was trying to do right by them in the way he understood how. He had not understood perhaps how very wrong it would go. Or maybe he had in those final weeks when the cholera was already in his blood and had simply had no power left to fix it. "She told him we was trouble," Henry said suddenly out of nowhere. "Martha, I heard her, when Papa was sick. She told him we was trouble, and we was going to be her burden when he was gone, and he said—" Henry stopped. "What did he say?" Clara asked. Henry was quiet for a moment. "He said, Martha, they're children. They're my children. They need somebody to love 'em. And she said—" Another pause. "She said, then they'd better find somebody else." The wind moved through the grass. "I didn't know that," Emily said. "I didn't want to say it before," Henry said. "Because Papa was still alive, and I thought maybe she didn't mean it." "She meant it," Clara said flatly. "Yeah, she meant all of it. From the beginning she meant it." Clara kept walking, kept her eyes on the trail ahead, kept her voice even. "But that's done now. That part of our life is done. We're going to find somebody, and we're going to be all right, and we're never going to think about Martha Blake again after tonight." "What if we don't find somebody?" Emily asked. "We will. But what if—" "Emily." Clara stopped walking and turned to face her sister. In the starlight, Emily's face was a pale oval, her eyes wide and dark, The rag doll pressed against her chest like a shield. She was 6 years old. She was somebody's little girl, lost in the middle of the biggest prairie in the world, and she deserved an honest answer, more than she deserved a comfortable lie. "I don't know," Clara said. "I truly don't know what happens if we don't find somebody. But I know that walking is better than standing still, and I know that giving up is worse than being scared, and I know that Mama didn't raise us to quit." She paused. She didn't raise us at all for very long, but what she did raise taught us enough, so we keep walking. Emily stared at her for a moment. Then she reached out and took Clara's hand. They kept walking. It was Henry who heard it first. He stopped so suddenly that Emily walked into him, and then Clara walked into Emily, and all three of them stood in a small tangled heap in the middle of the trail. "Shh," Henry said. "What?" Emily started. "Shh." Clara listened. For a moment she heard nothing but the wind and the distant yip of a coyote, and the sound of her own blood in her ears. Then she heard it, the soft rhythmic beat of hoofbeats, somewhere far off to the northeast, steady and purposeful. Not the sound of a spooked animal, but of a horse being ridden deliberately across ground, its rider knew well. "Somebody's coming," Henry breathed. "Could be anybody," Clara said carefully. She had grown up on stories of the trail, the good ones and the bad ones both. She knew that not every rider in the dark was a rescue. "Could be good somebody," Henry said. "Could be." "Do we call out?" Clara listened to the hoofbeats. They were getting louder. The rider wasn't on the trail itself. The sound was coming from the north across open ground, which meant somebody who knew the land well enough to ride it in the dark without a road under them. That was not a stranger passing through. That was somebody who belonged here. She made a decision. "Henry, give me the bread." He handed it over without question. She held it against her side and stepped forward to the center of the trail, and she raised both arms above her head and waved them. Even though she had no idea whether the rider could see her in the dark, even though her hands still stung from the fall, even though every sensible instinct she had was telling her that a child alone on a trail at night should be invisible, should be small, should not draw attention, her father's voice came back to her. "Sometimes you got to be the signal fire, Clara. Sometimes you got to trust that the person coming through the dark is looking for you." "Hey!" she shouted. Her voice came out bigger than she expected, raw and clear across the prairie. "Hey, over there! We need help!" The hoofbeats changed rhythm, slowed, stopped, silence. Then from the darkness to the north, a man's voice, deep, unhurried, carrying the kind of calm that came not from having nothing to worry about, but from having learned long ago how to carry worry without showing it. "Who's calling out there?" "Children," Clara shouted back. "3 of us. We're on the trail and we need help." A pause. The sound of a horse shifting its weight. "How many grown folks with you?" "None. Just us." Another pause, longer this time. She could hear the horse moving again slowly, now coming toward them in a wide, cautious arc, the way a careful man would approach something he wasn't sure of yet in the dark. "You all right?" the voice called. "Closer now." "We're not hurt bad," Clara called back. "But we ain't got water or shelter and it's getting cold." "Stay where you are. Don't move." "We ain't going anywhere," Henry muttered beside her. The rider came out of the dark, the way a ship comes out of fog slowly in pieces. First the sound, and then a shape, and then the specific gravity of a man on a horse, big and dark against the star-thick sky. He stopped his horse at the edge of the trail and looked down at them from the saddle, and even in the poor light, Clara could see the way his face shifted. Surprise, she thought, and then something that was not quite pity and was not quite sorrow, but was some combination of the two that sat in the lines around his eyes and the set of his mouth. "Lord Almighty," he said quietly to no one in particular. "Sir," Clara said. She kept her voice steady. She had decided in the 30 seconds since he'd appeared that she was not going to beg, and she was not going to cry, and she was not going to be anything other than what she was, a child who needed help, and was prepared to ask for it plainly. "My name is Clara Calloway. This is my sister Emily and my brother Henry. Our father died of cholera 3 weeks back on the trail. Our stepmother put us off the wagon tonight." She paused. "We got nowhere to go, and nobody to go to. I'm asking if you can help us." The man looked at her for a long moment. The horse stood perfectly still. "She put you off the wagon," he repeated. "Yes, sir." "On purpose?" "Yes, sir." "Tonight?" "About 2 hours back, we reckon." He looked from Clara to Emily to Henry, and then back to Clara. His face was hard to read in the dark, but something in the line of his shoulders changed, a settling, a kind of resolution, like a man reaching a decision he hadn't entirely planned to reach. "How old are you?" he asked. 8. Emily's 6. Henry's 5. He was quiet for another moment. Then he swung down from the saddle in one easy motion, the movement of a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it, and he crouched down to their level on the trail and looked at them directly. His face up close was older than his voice suggested, weathered brown, with lines at the corners of his eyes and a scar along his jaw that had faded from white to silver. He had dark eyes that caught the starlight, and he was looking at Clara with an expression she had never quite seen on an adult's face before. Not sympathy, not discomfort, not the careful blankness of someone calculating what this would cost them. Just attention. Full, honest attention, the kind that said he was looking at her and seeing a person. "My name is Samuel Holt," he said. "I own the Double H Ranch about 4 miles northeast of here. You all are going to come with me tonight. You're going to get warm. You're going to eat something, and you're going to sleep somewhere that ain't the middle of the Wyoming prairie. Is that agreeable to you?" Clara stared at him. In the stories her mother used to tell before she got sick, the soft ones with happy endings that mothers tell their children at night, a moment like this was simple. A stranger offers help. You take it. The end. But Clara had lived enough real life to know that nothing was ever that simple, and she had watched Martha Blake smile sweetly at her father for 3 months before they were married, and she had learned in the way that children who have been hurt learn to be careful with strangers who offered things too easily. "Why?" she said. He blinked. Whatever he'd expected, that wasn't it. "Why?" he repeated. "Why would you help us? You don't know us. We got nothing to give you. We're nobody." She held his gaze. "Why would you ride 4 miles out of your way for 3 children you never met?" He was quiet for a moment, and in that moment, she saw something move across his face that she couldn't entirely name. Pain, maybe, or memory, or something so old and deep in him that it didn't have a simple word attached to it anymore. "Because somebody should have," he said finally. "And nobody did. And I ain't willing to ride away from that." Clara looked at him. She looked at Emily, who had stopped crying completely, and was staring at Samuel Holt with the particular wide-eyed stillness of a child trying to decide whether to trust something. She looked at Henry, who was watching her the way he always watched her, waiting to follow her lead. She made her decision. "All right, Mr. Holt," she said. "We'll come." He nodded once the way men nod on the frontier when a thing has been decided and there's no need to make more of it than it is. Then he straightened up and turned to his horse, and in one practiced motion he lifted Henry up into the saddle, easy as picking up a sack of flour. And Henry grabbed the saddle horn with both hands and sat up very straight and looked down at his sisters with an expression of combined terror and pride. "You ain't gonna drop me?" Henry asked. "I ain't in the habit of it," Samuel said. He looked at Emily and held out his hand, and Emily looked at it for a long moment before she put her small hand into it. He lifted her up to sit behind Henry, and then he looked at Clara. "You gonna walk?" he asked. "I can," she said. "I know you can." He almost smiled. It was not a big smile, just a small shift at the corner of his mouth, but it reached his eyes, which Clara decided was the thing that mattered. Question was whether you wanted to. She looked at the saddle. She looked at her bleeding palms. She looked at the long dark trail stretching in both directions, at the enormous Wyoming sky above them, at the man standing in front of her with his horse and his steady eyes and his 4-mile-away ranch. For the first time since she'd hit the ground, something in her chest loosened by half a degree. "No," she said. "I don't want to walk anymore." He nodded. "Then let's get you home." He lifted her up to sit in front of Henry and Emily, and then he took the horse's reins and led it on foot the way a man does when the horse is carrying more than a saddle's worth of precious cargo. And they moved north across the dark prairie toward a house that was not theirs, and a man they did not know, and a future that was nothing but uncertain. But Clara kept her eyes open. She kept her hands loose at her sides, ready. She watched the back of Samuel Holt's hat moving steadily through the dark ahead of her, and she thought about what her father had said once, a long time ago, in a voice that was already beginning to thin with the illness he didn't know he had yet. He'd said, "The frontier will break you, Clara. Every last thing on it is hard. But every now and again, if you're paying attention, if you keep your eyes open and you don't give up, the frontier will also surprise you." She was paying attention. She kept her eyes open. And she did not give up. The Double H Ranch came out of the dark in pieces, a light in a window first, then the shape of a fence line, then the sound of horses shifting in a nearby stable, and finally, the low, solid bulk of a house that was bigger than anything the three Calloway children had lived in for the past 2 years on the trail. Samuel led his horse through the gate without hurrying, without speaking, and Clara sat up in the saddle and looked at the lit window and felt something move through her that she didn't have a name for yet. It wasn't safety. She wasn't ready to call it that. It was just the sight of a light in a window and the knowledge that somebody was on the other side of it. And right now, that was enough. Henry had fallen asleep against her back somewhere in the last mile, his head dropping onto her shoulder with the absolute boneless trust of a child who had exhausted every last reserve of fear and simply had nothing left to run on. Emily was awake, rigid, and watchful, the rag doll pressed to her chest. Samuel stopped the horse at the front steps and turned around. "There's a step down on the left," he said quietly, so as not to wake Henry. "Take it easy." Clara shifted Henry's weight and started to climb down, and Samuel was there before she had to ask steady hands at her waist, setting her on the ground without ceremony, then lifting Henry down with the same careful economy of motion, the boy's head lolling against the man's shoulder without waking. Henry made a small sound, something between a word and a sigh, and Samuel stood very still until the boy settled again. The front door opened. A woman filled the doorway, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, somewhere past 50, wearing an apron over a plain dress and holding a lantern in one hand and an expression on her face that moved through surprise and confusion and settled somewhere in the neighborhood of alarm. "Mr. Holt," she said. Then she looked at the children. Then she looked at Samuel. "What in the world?" "Evening, Maria." He came up the steps with Henry still against his shoulder like it was the most natural thing. "We're going to need the spare room, made up some warm water, and whatever's left from supper. In that order, if you can manage it." Maria Alvarez stared at the sleeping boy in his arms. She stared at Clara, standing on the bottom step, with Emily tucked against her side. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, which Clara noted was a thing adults did when they had 17 questions and couldn't decide which one to ask first. "Where did they come from?" Maria said. "The trail." Samuel looked at her directly. "Their stepmother put them off the wagon." Silence. Maria looked at the children again, and this time, whatever she saw in their faces, the dried mud on Clara's cheek, the raw skin on her palms, the hollowed-out look that children get when they've been frightened for too long in a row, settled something in her expression that replaced all her questions with something simpler and more immediate. She stepped back from the doorway and held it open wide. "Come in," she said. "Come in right now." The inside of the house was warm in a way that Clara felt in her back teeth. She hadn't realized how cold she'd gotten until the warmth hit her, and her hands began to sting with the returning circulation, and her legs, which had been numb for the last hour, started to feel heavy and real again. Emily made a small sound beside her and leaned more heavily against her hip. Maria set the lantern down and was already moving to the kitchen to the stove, speaking over her shoulder in a low, rapid voice that was half English and half something else, the mix of a woman who thought fastest in the language she'd grown up with. "Sit down. Sit down. Not on the floor, the bench. There, does anyone need a doctor? Are you hurt anywhere that I can't see?" "My hands," Clara said. "From the fall. They're not bad." Maria came back from the stove carrying a cloth and a bowl of water. She took Clara's hands without asking, turned them palm up, and looked at them with the practiced eye of a woman who had been cleaning up other people's injuries for a long time. She didn't wince. She didn't make any of the soft, horrified sounds that Clara had been bracing herself for. She just pressed the cloth against the torn skin and held it there steadily. "How far did you walk?" Maria asked. 2 hours, maybe. We're not sure." "In the dark?" "Yes, ma'am." Maria looked at her. "How old are you?" 8. Something crossed the older woman's face there, and gone like a cloud shadow on open ground. 8, she repeated softly. Then she looked down at the cloth and concentrated on what she was doing. Samuel had laid Henry on the bench along the wall still sleeping, and now he stood in the middle of the room looking at the three of them with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly by the brim in a way that Clara was beginning to recognize as the thing his hands did when he was thinking. "Maria," he said, "I heard you the first time. Spare room, warm water supper." She didn't look up from Clara's hands. "The room's already made. Go on, I'll take care of them." He didn't move immediately. "You sure?" "Samuel Holt. I have been taking care of things in this house for 6 years. Go tend your horse and let me do my work." He went and the door closed behind him, and the 3 Calloway children were alone with Maria Alvarez in the warm kitchen, and for the first time since the wagon had disappeared into the dark, Clara felt the tight wire in her chest go slack by 1 full degree. Emily spoke first. She looked up at Maria with her chin tucked and her eyes serious and said, "Are you going to make us leave in the morning?" Maria stopped. She looked at Emily for a long moment. Then she set the cloth down very deliberately, and she crouched down to eye level with Emily, the same way Samuel had crouched down on the trail, that same direct attention, that same refusal to be anything but present. "No," Maria said. "Nobody is making anybody leave anything tomorrow morning. Do you understand me?" Emily studied her face. "Martha used to say that too. She used to say we were welcome, before she didn't." Maria held her gaze. "I am not Martha," she said, "and this is not that wagon." Emily looked at her for another beat. Then she held out the rag doll. It was a small gesture, and Clara almost missed what it meant, but she'd grown up with Emily, and she knew. Emily had not let go of that doll voluntarily in 2 years. Not for washing, not for mending, not for any adult who asked to hold it. The last person she'd handed it to had been their father 3 days before he died, when he was too weak to sit up, and Emily had pressed it into his hands and said, "Keep it warm, Papa," and he had. The fact that she was holding it out to Maria Alvarez, who she'd known for 4 minutes, was not a small thing. Maria took the doll carefully in both hands. She looked at it. "She's beautiful," she said. "Her name is Ruth," Emily said. "After Mama." "That's a good name." Maria handed Ruth back with the same care she'd received her. "Ruth can sleep in the spare room with you tonight if that's all right." Emily tucked the doll back against her chest and nodded. Henry woke up at some point during supper, a bowl of beef stew that Maria produced from the back of the stove, thick and hot, the kind of food that had no business being this good at this hour, and he sat up on the bench and looked around the room with the blinking confusion of a child who has forgotten for 1 merciful second where he is and how he got there. Then he remembered, and his face did the thing that Clara had been watching it do all night, that cycling through grief and fear and the exhausting effort of being 5 years old and brave. "I'm hungry," he announced. "Good," said Maria, setting a bowl in front of him. "Eat." He ate. He ate with the focused intensity of a child who has not had enough food for days. Not just tonight, Clara realized, but for weeks, because Martha had been careful with the provisions in a way that was less about conservation and more about control, doling out portions in a manner that left the children always slightly short, always aware that what was in the wagon was not theirs. Clara watched her brother eat and felt something cold and clear settle in the center of her chest. Not anger exactly. Something older than anger and quieter and harder to dislodge. Samuel came back in from the stable when the children were halfway through their supper. He hung his hat on the peg by the door and crossed to the stove without speaking, and Maria handed him a cup of coffee without being asked, and he leaned against the counter and drank it, and watched the three of them eat with an expression that Clara, from across the table, spent a good deal of effort trying to read. It wasn't pity. She'd been looked at with pity before, and it always felt like being weighed and found light. This was different. It was more like the look her father used to get sometimes in the evenings when he thought nobody was watching, a look that was tired and glad at the same time, that said the world had handed this man more than his share of hard things, and he was still here regardless. "Mr. Holt," she said. He looked at her. "Why is the spare room already made up?" The question landed in the room and sat there. Maria turned from the stove and said nothing. Samuel lowered his coffee cup and looked at Clara with those steady dark eyes, and she could see him deciding something. "It was my son's room," he said. "He didn't make it past his first week. His mother went with him." He paused. "That was 4 years ago." The kitchen was very quiet. Henry had stopped eating. Emily was looking at Samuel with her head tilted slightly to one side. The way she looked at things, she was trying to understand. "I'm sorry," Clara said. Because she was, and because she knew what it meant to say it, and mean it, and because this man had ridden out of the dark to find them, and she wasn't going to pretend his loss was nothing just because her own was large. "So am I," he said, simple as that. He took another drink of his coffee. Henry said, "Does it get better? Losing somebody?" Samuel looked at him. Henry looked back entirely serious. The question asked from the truest place in him, a 5-year-old boy who had buried his father 3 weeks ago and needed to know if the weight of it would always be exactly this heavy. "Some," Samuel said after a moment. "Not all the way, but some." Henry nodded slowly, like he was filing this information away in a careful place. "Papa said something like that, before he got too sick to talk much." He picked up his spoon again. "He said the missing doesn't go away, but you get bigger around it." Something happened to Samuel Holt's face in that moment. It was not dramatic, no tears, no visible breaking of anything, just a small shift, a slight loosening, like a door that had been shut for a long time, moving fractionally on its hinges. "Your papa sounds like he was a wise man," Samuel said. "He was," Henry said. "He was the best man I ever knew." He looked at Samuel directly. "You seem pretty all right so far, too." Maria made a sound from the stove that might have been a cough. Clara pressed her lips together. Samuel looked down at his coffee cup and said very quietly, "Well, I appreciate that, son." The word landed softly, unplanned, just a word men used with boys on the frontier. And yet Clara saw Henry go very still when he heard it, and saw the way his grip tightened on his spoon, for just a second before he relaxed it again, and went back to his stew. And she understood that her brother had felt it the same way. She felt a warm hand on a cold night, not a promise yet, but a possibility. Maria got them to bed before the hour was out. The spare room had 2 narrow beds pushed together, and Emily and Henry were asleep within minutes of lying down. Emily with Ruth tucked under her chin. Henry flat on his back with his arms at his sides, like a soldier at rest. Clara lay between them and looked at the ceiling and listened to the sounds of the house settling around them, the creak of the floorboards in the hall, the low murmur of voices from the kitchen, where Samuel and Maria were talking too quietly to be heard, and she could not sleep. She didn't fight it. Sleep felt dangerous in a way she couldn't fully explain, like a door she wasn't ready to walk through yet, because she didn't entirely trust what was on the other side of it. She lay there for a long time. Then the voices in the kitchen stopped, and she heard the front door open and close, and after a moment, she got up carefully so as not to wake the others, and she padded down the hallway in her bare feet, and she pushed open the front door and stepped outside. Samuel was sitting on the top step of the porch. He had his coffee cup still, or a new one, she couldn't tell, and he was looking out at the dark prairie the way men look at things that are too big to see all at once. He didn't turn around when she came out, but he also didn't look surprised the way you aren't surprised by something you were half expecting. "Can't sleep," he said. "No, sir." She sat down on the step below his, pulling her knees up under her chin. The night air was cold, but not brutal, and the stars were still out, as many as before. just as indifferent and just as beautiful. "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to." They sat in silence for a while. An owl called somewhere off in the dark. The horses moved in the stable. "Mr. Holt," Clara said. "Samuel," he said. "Mr. Holt was my father, and he was considerably less agreeable than I aimed to be. Samuel." She tried the name carefully. "What happens tomorrow, with us I mean? What actually happens?" He looked down at his coffee. He was quiet long enough that she started to think he was going to say something careful and adult and evasive, the kind of answer that meant nothing, because the person giving it didn't know what to say. Instead he said, "I don't rightly know yet, but I know you ain't going back to that woman." "She might try to take us back," Clara said. "She was married to our father. She might say she has legal right to us." "She might say that. Does she?" He looked at her, and in the dim light from the window behind them, his face was serious and unhurried. "There are men in this territory who know the law better than I do," he said, "and I intend to talk to every last one of them. But I'll tell you what I know right now, which is that a woman who puts 3 children off a moving wagon in the dark of the Wyoming prairie does not have a rightful claim to those children that I am obligated to honor." He paused. "And I am not a man who honors things he isn't obligated to." Clara looked at him steadily. "What if it costs you something, going up against her? Then it costs me something." "What if it cost you a lot?" He met her eyes. "Clara, I own 4,000 acres and the best cattle operation in 3 counties. The only things I've had to spend that on for 4 years are feed and wages." He picked up his coffee cup. "I reckon I can afford to spend some of it on what matters." She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with it for a moment, turning it over, feeling the weight of it. Then the sound of hoofbeats came out of the dark fast from the direction of the main road, and Samuel was on his feet before Clara had fully registered what she was hearing. He stepped off the porch and turned toward the sound, and his hand went to his hip in the automatic gesture of a man who was used to wearing a gun and had not put one on to sit on his own porch. A rider came through the gate at a canter and pulled up hard in the yard. Clara recognized him as one of the ranch hands she'd seen moving around the stable when they arrived, younger, wiry, with the look of someone who had been riding hard for longer than was comfortable. "Beg pardon, boss," he said, breathing slightly faster than normal. "Thought you'd want to know right away." He glanced at Clara, then back at Samuel. "There's a woman. Stopped at the Harmon place about 2 miles south on the main road. Asking questions. Asking if anybody's seen 3 children on the trail tonight." He paused. "Said they were hers." The silence that followed was complete. Samuel turned very slowly and looked down at Clara on the steps. She looked back at him, and she could feel the blood leaving her face, and she could feel the old terror starting to claw its way back up from wherever she'd managed to push it down. The sound of wagon wheels rolling away, the bread loaf hitting the dirt. The blank look on Martha Blake's face. "How long ago?" Samuel said. "Hour, maybe less. Harmon sent her on. Didn't tell her nothing." The rider hesitated. "But boss, she said she's coming to all the ranches. Said she ain't leaving without her children." Samuel looked at Clara for one more moment. Then he turned back to the rider, and his voice when he spoke was the quietest it had been all night, which Clara was already learning meant it was also the most certain. "Go get Dawson," he said. "Tell him I need him on the gate before sunrise. Nobody comes onto this property without my word. Nobody." He paused. "And somebody better find out where the nearest judge is sleeping tonight." Clara didn't move from the porch step right away. She sat with the rider's words settling over her like cold water, and she watched Samuel's face in the dim light, and she thought with the particular clarity that comes to children who have been frightened often enough that fear no longer paralyzes them, that she needed to go inside, and she needed to wake her brother and sister, and she needed to tell them the truth before the morning did it for her. She stood up. Samuel turned at the movement. "Go back inside," he said. "Not unkindly. Lock nothing. I don't want you feeling locked in anywhere. But stay in the room with the others." "She's coming here," Clara said. "She might." "She is." Clara looked at him steadily. Martha doesn't ask questions unless she already knows the answer she wants. She's not looking. She knows where we are." Samuel held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, the slight nod of a man adjusting his understanding of the situation. "All right. Then we'll be ready before she gets here." "What does ready look like?" "It looks like you and your brother and sister inside this house, and me out here, and Dawson at the gate, and every man on this property knowing that nothing comes through that fence without my word." He looked at her directly. "Can you trust me to handle the outside of this if I trust you to handle the inside?" She thought about it for exactly 1 second. "Yes," she said. "Good. Go." She went. Henry was awake when she pushed open the bedroom door, sitting up in the dark with his knees pulled to his chest, listening the way animals listen when they sense something has changed in the air around them. Emily was still asleep, one hand curled around Ruth, her breathing slow and even. "I heard a horse," Henry said quietly. "I know." Clara sat on the edge of the bed. "Henry, I need to tell you something, and I need you to stay calm when I tell it." His jaw tightened. "Is it Martha?" "She's asking around. Nearby." Clara kept her voice flat and factual, the way their father had always delivered hard news straight without decoration, because decoration just made hard things take longer to arrive. "She might come here in the morning." Henry was silent for a moment. Then, "Samuel won't let her take us." "I don't think he will." "You don't think, or you know." "I know," she said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. "I know." Henry looked at her in the dark. "She's going to say she has rights to us. She's going to try." "Does she?" "Samuel's going to find a judge." Henry absorbed this. He looked down at his hands on his knees and was quiet long enough that Clara thought he might have gone somewhere inside himself, the way he did sometimes, that unreachable place where 5-year-old boys put things they can't process yet. Then he said very quietly, "Clara, Martha told me something. Before she put us off the wagon. I didn't tell you before because I didn't understand it then." Clara went still. "What did she say?" She was talking to herself mostly. She does that when she thinks nobody's listening. Henry looked up. She said Papa had a land deed, back in Oregon, for a parcel he'd bought before he got sick. She said the deed went to his heirs. He paused. She said we were the heirs, but she was the wife, and the wife could manage on behalf of children who were too young to manage for themselves. The room was very quiet. "She put us off the wagon," Clara said slowly, "and now she's looking for us." "If we're lost," Henry said with the terrible logic of a 5-year-old who has understood something no child should have to understand. "She can say she don't know where we are. And if we're lost long enough, she gets the land," Clara finished. Henry nodded. Clara sat with that for a long moment. The shape of it settled over everything that had happened in the last 12 hours and made it make sense in the worst possible way. Not cruelty for cruelty's sake. Not a woman who simply didn't want them, but a woman who had done the arithmetic and decided that 3 children lost on the Wyoming prairie were worth more to her than 3 children alive and claiming what their father had left them. "We have to tell Samuel," she said. "In the morning. Now!" She found him still on the porch speaking low with the ranch hand, and she stood in the doorway and said his name once, and he turned and she told him everything Henry had said in flat, precise sentences, the way you report facts when the facts are already bad enough without adding drama to them. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a full 10 seconds. Then he turned to the ranch hand and said, "Ride to Laramie, tonight. Find Judge Calhoun and tell him Samuel Holt needs him at the Double H by morning on a matter of child welfare and estate fraud. Tell him I said please, and then tell him I said I don't care what he's got planned." The rider was gone before Clara could draw a full breath. Samuel looked at her. "You did right telling me." "I should have put it together sooner," she said. "You're 8 years old, and you've been awake since before the wagon threw you." Something moved in his voice, not quite anger, not at her. "You put it together fast enough. Go sleep." She almost said she couldn't sleep. Then she thought about Henry alone in the dark with his logic and his grief, and she thought about Emily, who would wake up confused and frightened if she was alone, and she went back inside and lay down between them and closed her eyes, and without entirely intending to slept. She woke to Maria's voice, low and urgent, coming through the wall. The light through the window was gray, and early, not quite sunrise, the sky the color of an old pewter cup. Clara sat up. Beside her, Emily stirred. Henry was already awake, sitting with his chin on his knees, his eyes at the door. "She's here," Henry said. Clara heard it then, from somewhere beyond the front of the house, a woman's voice carrying across the morning cold, high and tight, with the specific register of someone performing a righteous anger they don't entirely feel. She'd heard that voice for 14 months. She'd know it at the bottom of a well. She got up. Henry got up. Emily woke fully and reached for Ruth and clutched her in both arms and looked at her siblings with enormous eyes. "Stay here," Clara told her. "No," Emily said. "Emily, no." Emily stood up off the bed, Ruth against her chest, her chin set in the way it got when she had made up her mind about something and the entire Wyoming frontier was not going to move her. "She threw me off a moving wagon. I am not hiding in a bedroom." Clara looked at her sister, 6 years old, 70 pounds, soaking wet, the rag doll pressed to her heart like a battle standard. She looked at Henry, who was already moving toward the door. "All right," she said. "Together." The front room was full of mourning and tension in equal measure. Maria stood near the door with her arms crossed and her face composed into the expression of a woman who has seen considerably worse than this and is not impressed. Through the front window, which Clara did not look out of because she did not want Martha Blake to see her looking, the voice was louder. "I know they're here. I know it. You've got my children in that house, and you'd better bring them out, or I will have the law on you before noon." Samuel's voice came back unhurried. "Ma'am, you're going to want to lower your voice." "Don't you tell me to lower my voice. Those are my children and I want them back. They're on my property and they're safe, which is more than I can say for where they were 8 hours ago." A pause. Then with a shift in register, calculating now, not righteous, "I don't know what they told you. Children say things. They misremember. They get confused and frightened and they say things that aren't. They told me you put them off a moving wagon in the dark." Samuel's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. "At night, on the Wyoming prairie, without water." Silence. "I want to speak with them," Martha said. "Whatever they told you, I have the right to speak with them." Clara opened the front door. She hadn't planned it precisely. It was not a decision so much as a movement. Her body going where her mind had been heading since she'd heard the first word of that voice through the wall. She stepped out onto the porch and stood in the early morning light and looked at Martha Blake across the yard. Martha was still in her traveling clothes. She looked exactly as she always looked. Neat, composed, the kind of woman who understood the power of presentation and used it with the precision of someone who'd had to rely on it for a long time. She looked at Clara, and something moved fast across her face, relief and calculation in a sequence so rapid that most people would have missed it. Clara was not most people. She had been reading Martha Blake's face for 14 months. "Clara?" Martha's voice shifted into warmth the way a lamp shifts when you turn the wick up, mechanical and immediate. "Oh, Clara, sweetheart, I have been so frightened. I've been looking everywhere." "You know where we were," Clara said. "You put us there." "Honey, that's not—" "You grabbed my wrist," Clara said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of Samuel to her left still and watchful, and of Henry coming to stand beside her on the porch, and of Emily, a half step behind with Ruth pressed to her chest. "You grabbed my wrist and you pulled me to the edge and you pushed me off. Then Emily. Then Henry. And you threw the bread out after us and you didn't look back." Martha's warmth flickered. "You misunderstood what was happening. I was frightened. There had been a scare, I thought I heard." "You didn't say a word," Henry said from Clara's right. His voice was clear and flat and completely without the wobble she'd half expected. "You didn't say nothing. You just pushed." Martha looked at Henry. Her jaw shifted slightly. "Henry, you were half asleep. You don't remember it right." "I remember everything right," Henry said. "I remember you telling Papa when he was sick that we were going to be your burden. I remember every word of it." Something happened to Martha Blake's face, then a tightening, a retreat, the look of a woman who has just discovered that the child she dismissed as small and ignorant had been listening all along. She recovered fast. She was good at recovering. "Mr. Holt." She turned to Samuel with the full force of her composure aimed directly at him. "I understand you're trying to do right by these children, and I respect that. I do. But they are my legal stepchildren, my late husband's children. I am their guardian under the law of this territory, and whatever misunderstanding happened last night, it doesn't change the legal fact that these children belong with me." "They belong with someone who wants them," Samuel said. "I want them, ma'am." His voice was so quiet it was almost gentle. "You were asking around last night about a land deed." The silence that followed was sharp as a blade. Martha's face went very still. "I don't know what you think you—" James Calloway filed the land claim in Oregon before he died. Parcel in the Willamette Valley, 200 acres. Samuel looked at her with the patience of a man who has decided exactly how much rope to let out and is not in any hurry. "His children are his heirs. You are his widow, which gives you certain rights of management over a minor's inherited property." He paused. "Which means as long as these children are yours, so is the land." Martha said nothing. Her face was a careful, practiced blank. "But if they're not yours," Samuel continued, "if legal guardianship passes to another party, then the land goes entirely to the children, to be held in trust until they're of age." He tilted his head slightly. "I'm told Judge Calhoun is particular about things like that." Martha's jaw tightened by a fraction. "You have no proof of anything. I have 3 children who can testify to what happened on that trail. I have a rider out finding wagon masters who were on this stretch last night. I have the marks on Clara's hands from where she hit the ground." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "And I have a judge writing from Laramie, who I expect will find all of that considerably more compelling than whatever you were planning to say this morning." For a long moment, Martha Blake stood in the yard of the Double H Ranch and looked at Samuel Holt, and then at the 3 children on the porch, and then back at Samuel. And in her face, Clara could see the calculation running, the assessment of odds, the measuring of this man against what she'd expected him to be, the adjustment of every plan she'd ridden out here with. "You're going to regret this," Martha said, quietly. The warmth entirely gone now, and something colder and more honest in its place. "You're a single man, with a dead wife, and a dead child, and a ranch full of hired hands. You think you can take on the legal care of 3 orphaned children. You think any judge in Wyoming is going to look at you and see a fit guardian." Samuel was quiet for a moment. Then from behind, Clara. Maria Alvarez came through the front door and stood on the porch beside the children, wiping her hands on her apron, and said, "He won't be looking at Mr. Holt alone, Mrs. Blake." Martha looked at Maria. "My name is Maria Alvarez," Maria said pleasantly. "I have been the housekeeper of this ranch for 6 years. I have cooked for, cleaned for, and managed the household of one of the most respected men in this territory. And I will tell any judge who asks that those children slept safely and ate well and were treated with kindness in this house last night." She paused. "Which is more than I expect you can say for the 14 months before." Martha looked at Maria. She looked at Samuel. She looked at Clara. And Clara held her gaze and did not look away, and finally Martha said with a coldness that was almost businesslike, "This isn't finished." "No," Samuel said. "It isn't, but this part of it is." He stepped slightly to the side and gestured toward the gate, easy and final, the way a man gestures when the conversation has reached its natural end, and there's nothing left to be polite about. "I'd like you off my property, ma'am. You're welcome to come back with a lawyer and whatever legal argument you've got. I'll have one waiting." Martha Blake looked at him for one more long moment. Then she turned and walked back through the gate, and the sound of her horse moving away was the best sound Clara had heard since she'd heard the hoofbeats of Samuel's horse coming toward them in the dark the night before. Nobody on the porch spoke for a moment. Then Henry said, "She's going to come back." "Yes," Samuel said. "With a lawyer." "Probably." Henry looked up at him. "Are you scared?" Samuel looked down at him, and for the first time since Clara had met him, Something in his face shifted all the way open. Not the careful, measured expressions of a man managing a difficult situation, but the honest face of a person who has decided without entirely planning to, that he is all the way in on something regardless of the cost. "A little," he said, "but not of her." "Then what?" Henry asked. Samuel looked at all three of them. Clara with her torn hands and her straight spine, Henry with his 5-year-old logic and his father's eyes, Emily with her rag doll and her 6-year-old refusal to hide in a bedroom. He looked at them the way a man looks at something that matters to him, something that has gotten past all the careful walls he built for exactly this kind of mattering. "Of not being enough," he said quietly. "That's all." Emily stepped forward. She crossed the porch in 3 small steps and she held out Ruth, and this time she didn't take her back. She just held her out and looked at Samuel until he reached down and accepted the doll in his big weathered hands, and she said in a voice entirely too serious for a 6-year-old on a cold Wyoming morning, "You're enough. Ruth says so." Samuel Holt looked down at the small rag doll in his hands. His throat moved once. "Well," he said after a moment, "I reckon I'd better not argue with Ruth." Judge Calhoun arrived at 9:30 in the morning, which was faster than Samuel had expected, and considerably faster than Martha Blake's lawyer, who arrived 20 minutes after the judge and spent those 20 minutes at a disadvantage he never entirely recovered from. The judge was a compact man, somewhere north of 60, with white hair, and the kind of face that had listened to so many arguments over so many years that it had settled into a permanent expression of measured patience. He came through the gate on a gray mare and dismounted and shook Samuel's hand, and looked at the house and said, "You said child welfare and estate fraud. I'd like to hear the child welfare part first." "Inside," Samuel said. "I'll have Maria put coffee on." "Good. I've been riding since before sunrise, and I am not in a charitable mood." They sat in the main room, the judge at the table, Samuel across from him, and Clara beside Samuel, because when the judge had looked at the children assembled near the kitchen doorway and said, "Which one is the eldest?" and Clara had said, "I am, sir." He had looked at her for a long moment and said, "Come sit down. I expect I'll want to hear from you directly." Henry and Emily stayed in the kitchen with Maria, which satisfied nobody except Maria, who told them both firmly that they would hear everything through the wall if they kept quiet, and that keeping quiet was therefore in their best interest. Clara sat at the table with her hands folded and told Judge Calhoun everything. She told it the same way she'd told it to Samuel on the trail, flat and factual, in order without decoration. She told him about their father's illness and death, about the 14 months with Martha, about the food and the cold shoulders, and the words overheard through wagon canvas late at night. She told him about the wrist, the shove, Emily, Henry, the bread, the dark. The judge listened without writing anything down which she'd been prepared for. He just watched her face. When she finished, he said, "How old are you?" "8, sir." "You speak like someone considerably older." "My father taught me that facts don't need to be dressed up to be true." Something shifted slightly in the judge's expression. He looked at Samuel. Samuel said nothing, just drank his coffee. "The stepmother," the judge said. "Has she been notified that you've requested a hearing?" "She came here this morning on her own," Samuel said. "She's been informed that you're coming. I expect she and her lawyer will be here within the hour." He was right by 40 minutes. Martha Blake arrived with a man named Gerald Fitch, who was tall and silver-haired, and carried a leather case with the self-assurance of someone who had won enough arguments to confuse winning with being right. He shook the judge's hand with both of his own, which Clara noted and filed away. "Judge Calhoun." Fitch set his case on the table with a decisive click. "I appreciate your prompt attention to what is at its core a straightforward matter. My client is the legal widow of James Calloway, which makes her the legal guardian of his 3 minor children under Wyoming territorial law. Mr. Holt, however well-intentioned, has no legal standing to retain these children, and I'd ask the court to—" "Sit down, Gerald," the judge said. "I'll tell you when it's your turn." Fitch sat. Martha sat beside him, her hands in her lap, her face composed into something that read as grief-stricken from a distance, and was considerably more calculating up close. She looked at Clara once. Clara looked back and did not look away, and Martha looked elsewhere. "I want to hear from a witness," the judge said. "Someone other than the children who can speak to the events of last night." Samuel nodded. He looked toward the door and said, "Send Cooper in." Clara hadn't known about Cooper. She saw Martha Blake's composure shift just slightly, a tightening around the eyes, and she understood that Martha hadn't known about him either. He came through the door with his hat in both hands. A broad man in trail clothes, with the sunburned neck of someone who spent his life outdoors, and he sat down heavily in the chair Samuel indicated and looked at the judge with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of someone who had nothing to lie about. "Your name?" the judge said. "Elias Cooper, wagon master out of Independence. I run the Northern Trail route, have done for 11 years. You were on the trail last night?" "Yes, sir. Half-mile south of where the Double H fence line starts. I was riding ahead of my train checking the ground. I saw a wagon. One wagon, no train moving northwest at a pace that wasn't normal for that hour." He paused. "I saw something go off the side of it. First I thought cargo, maybe a barrel loose. Then I saw it move." His jaw tightened. "I turned my horse and I rode over, but the wagon was already too far gone in the dark. What I found was 3 children in the middle of the trail. Eldest one was already up on her feet. Martha's lawyer was on his feet. "Your Honor, this man has no—" "Gerald," the judge said. Fitch sat. "You saw the wagon clearly enough to identify it?" the judge asked Cooper. "Single canvas gray patched with a broke left wheel, spoke that wobbled. I'd seen that wagon 2 days before at the Sweetwater crossing. Woman driving it was traveling alone with 3 children." He looked at Martha directly. "That woman." The room was very quiet. Martha said to her lawyer very quietly through her teeth, "Say something." Fitch leaned forward. "Your Honor, the fact that this man saw a wagon on a public trail proves nothing about my client's intentions. The children may have what?" Clara said. Every head turned. Clara had not meant to speak. Or rather, she had meant to keep quiet, because Samuel had asked her to let the adults handle the legal part, and she had agreed, and she was breaking that agreement right now, and could not stop herself. "Clara," Samuel said. "No." She looked at Fitch. "The children may have what fallen off by accident, all 3 of us in order, and then the bread fell out by itself." She kept her voice level. Her father's voice. "Facts don't need to be dressed up to be true. I was grabbed by the wrist and pushed. I hit the ground hard enough to tear my palms open. My sister is 6 years old. My brother is 5. You can say whatever legal words you want to say about intentions, but you cannot make what happened into something it wasn't." Fitch stared at her. He was not, Clara noted, a man who was used to being addressed directly by 8-year-olds. "Young lady," he said, recovering his composure, "you are a child, and children's memories are—" "Her memories match Cooper's testimony," Samuel said quietly. "And Cooper has no stake in this. Furthermore," Fitch pressed on, adjusting course, "my client has a legal document that supersedes any question of guardianship." He opened his leather case and produced a folded paper, which he placed on the table in front of the judge with the manner of someone playing what he believes to be the final card. James Calloway's land deed registered in Oregon, and a signed codicil dated 2 weeks before his death assigning management rights over his children's inheritance to his wife Martha Blake Calloway in the event of his death. Notarized in the territory of Wyoming. Samuel looked at the paper. He looked at Martha. He looked at the judge. He said quietly, "May I see that?" The judge handed it across. Samuel read it, and something changed in his face. Not panic, but a specific kind of stillness that Clara was already learning meant he was thinking fast underneath a calm surface. Martha spoke for the first time since she'd sat down. "James wanted the children protected," she said, and her voice had recovered the warmth, the grief, the performance of a woman wronged. "He wanted me to manage what was theirs until they were old enough. That was his wish, notarized and legal. Whatever these children told you, whatever this man thinks he saw on a trail in the dark, A piece of paper signed by their father in sound mind carries more weight than any of it. The judge took the document back and read it himself. The room was very quiet. Henry's voice came through the kitchen doorway. "She's lying." Maria said, "Henry." "She's lying," Henry said again, and then he came through the doorway into the room, which nobody had told him he could do, and he stood in the middle of the floor and looked at the judge with those dark, earnest eyes and said, "My papa was already too sick to hold a pen 2 weeks before he died. His hands shook so bad he couldn't button his own coat. I helped him every morning. I buttoned his coat every single morning." He paused. He didn't sign nothing 2 weeks before he died. He couldn't. The silence that followed was a different kind than the ones before it. Fitch said, "The boy is 5 years old." "He is," the judge said. "And he makes a specific verifiable claim." He looked at the document again, then looked at Martha. "Mrs. Blake, if this notarization can be confirmed, it settles the matter. If it cannot..." He left the sentence where it was and looked at Fitch. "Gerald, I'd like to know who notarized this document and where I can find them." Fitch said a name. Samuel said immediately and without inflection, "That notary left Laramie 8 months ago. Nobody knows where he went." Another silence. Martha's composure held. She was remarkable at holding composure, Clara thought. She had to give her that. She held it the way a person holds something they know is slipping, with both hands white-knuckled and a face that showed none of the effort. "Your Honor," Martha said, "I loved my husband. I love his children. Whatever happened on that trail last night was a terrible mistake and a moment of..." "You said we were a burden." Emily's voice came from the kitchen doorway, clear as a struck bell. Martha stopped. Emily was standing in the doorway with Ruth held against her chest, and she was looking at Martha Blake the way a 6-year-old looks at something that frightened her for a long time, and has now become something she is no longer willing to be frightened by. "You said it to Papa when he was sick, and you thought we were asleep," Emily said. "You said we were your burden, and he said we were his children and needed someone to love us. And you said then they better find somebody else." She looked at the judge. "Sir, I don't misremember things. Clara says I have a memory like a steel trap. Papa said that too." She held Ruth out slightly. And Ruth was in the room when Martha said it. Something that might have been laughter suppressed immediately moved across Cooper's face. The judge looked at Emily for a long moment. Then he looked at Martha. Then he looked down at the document in his hands. "Gerald," he said, "I am going to have this notarization verified. If it is found to be legitimate, we will proceed accordingly. If it is found to be otherwise..." He set the paper down. "The penalty for filing a fraudulent document in a custody proceeding is considerably more unpleasant than losing the proceeding." Martha leaned to Fitch and spoke in a low voice. Fitch spoke back. Clara watched their faces and could read exactly nothing from either of them, which told her more than reading something would have. Then Martha sat back and looked at Samuel and said, "What do you want?" Samuel looked at her for a moment. "I beg your pardon. You heard me." The warmth was entirely gone now. The performance was gone. What was left was a woman who had made a calculation and lost, and was cutting her losses with the brisk efficiency of someone who had done it before. "You clearly want something, or you wouldn't have a judge here before the day is an hour old. What is it?" Samuel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was even. "I want legal guardianship of these 3 children. I want the Oregon land deed placed in trust under the judge's supervision until each child reaches majority. I want your name removed from any legal document relating to James Calloway's estate. And I want your word for whatever it's worth that you will not contest this, because contesting it means that document gets examined, and we both know what that examination will find." Martha looked at him. She looked at the children. She looked at Clara last, and Clara met her eyes and held them. And in Martha's face, she saw for just a moment something that was not calculation and not performance, something that was almost a person, somewhere underneath everything Martha Blake had chosen to become. Then it was gone. "Fine," Martha said. Flat. Final. Fitch said, "Martha, I'd advise you not to. I said, fine, Gerald. She stood up. She didn't look at the children again. She picked up her gloves from the table, and she walked to the door, and she stopped with her hand on the frame and said without turning around, James should have married someone who wanted them. Nobody answered. The door closed behind her. The room let out a breath it had been holding for an hour. Henry said, Is she gone? For real gone? For real gone, Samuel said. Henry sat down on the floor right where he was standing, which was not a chair, and put his face in his hands, and the sound he made was not crying exactly. It was the sound of something unwinding, some wire that had been pulled too tight for too long. Finally releasing the sound of a 5-year-old boy who had been holding himself together across the longest night of his life, finally allowing himself to come apart a little in a room where it was safe to do so. Maria was beside him before anyone else moved. She sat on the floor next to him, which was not a thing Clara had ever seen an adult do before, just sit on the floor like it was the most natural place, and she put her arm around him and said nothing, just held him, and Henry leaned against her and let her. Judge Calhoun looked at Samuel. I'll need statements, written ones from the children and from Cooper and from you. The notarization will take 2 weeks to verify, but given the circumstances, I'm prepared to grant temporary guardianship immediately. He paused. You understand what you're taking on? Yes, sir, Samuel said. 3 children. Yes, sir. On your own. Samuel looked at Maria on the floor with Henry against her side, and at Emily in the doorway with her rag doll, and at Clara beside him at the table with her torn hands folded in her lap and 8 years of too much life in her eyes. Not entirely on my own, he said. The judge nodded slowly. He reached into his coat and produced a folded paper and a pen, and he began to write, and the scratching of that pen across that paper was the quietest and most important sound Clara Calloway had ever heard in her life. She reached under the table and found Samuel's hand and held it. He didn't say anything. He just closed his hand around hers and held on the way. You hold something you're not planning to let go of, and kept his eyes on the judge and waited for the words that would make it real. The 2 weeks that followed were the strangest of Clara Calloway's life, and she had lived through enough strange to have a reliable basis for comparison. Strange because every morning she woke up in a bed that had clean sheets, and every morning Maria was in the kitchen before anyone else, and every morning the smell of coffee and cornbread moved through the house like something alive. Strange because Henry laughed. Actually laughed, the big unguarded kind he hadn't used since before their father got sick, when Samuel put him up on a horse named Duchess and walked them around the yard at a pace so slow it was almost standing still. Strange because Emily stopped sleeping with Ruth pressed to her face like armor and started leaving the doll on the windowsill during the day, which was as close to ease as Emily knew how to get. Strange most of all because Clara kept waiting for something to go wrong, and nothing did. She mentioned this to Samuel one evening when the others were inside, and she'd found him on the porch again, which was becoming a habit between them, the two of them, and the dark and the prairie, and the things that were easier to say when you didn't have to look directly at the person you were saying them to. I keep thinking it's going to fall apart, she said. I know, he said. You know, I can see it on your face. Every morning when you come to breakfast, you look at the table like you're checking to make sure it's still there. She hadn't realized she was doing that. Is that bad? No, it's sense. You learned sense the hard way. He drank his coffee. But Clara, sense and fear ain't the same thing. One of them is useful. The other one just wears you out. She thought about that. What if the notarization comes back legitimate? It won't. But what if... It won't, he said again, not hard, just certain. A man who can't button his own coat doesn't sign legal documents. And Judge Calhoun has been reading documents for 30 years. He knows the difference between a real notarization and a convenient one. He looked at her. You trust me. She thought about the trail in the dark. She thought about his hands lifting Henry into the saddle. She thought about the way he'd stood between them and Martha Blake without raising his voice once. Yes, she said. Then let me do the worrying about the legal part. You concentrate on being 8 years old for a while. Lord knows you've had enough of the other kind." She almost smiled. "I'm not sure I remember how." "Henry can teach you. He's been practicing all week." He glanced sideways at her. "Kid's got a gift for it." She did smile then. She couldn't help it. Couldn't. The word came on a Thursday, delivered by a writer from Laramie carrying a sealed envelope from Judge Calhoun's office, and Samuel opened it at the kitchen table, with all 3 children watching him and Maria standing in the doorway with her arms crossed in the way she stood when she was trying to look calm and wasn't entirely succeeding. He read it once. He read it again. Then he set it down on the table and looked at the children. "The notarization is fraudulent," he said. "The notary whose name is on that document was paid to leave Wyoming 8 months ago. There's a warrant out for his arrest." He paused. "And there is now an investigation open into Martha Blake for filing a fraudulent legal document in a custody proceeding." Henry said, "What does that mean, in plain words?" "It means she broke the law. Seriously." "Is she going to jail?" "That's up to the territorial court." Samuel looked at all 3 of them steadily. "What it means for you is that her claim to guardianship is void, completely. There is nothing legal tying you to her anymore." He picked up the letter again and looked at the last paragraph. "Judge Calhoun will be here Friday to finalize the permanent guardianship order." Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Emily sat down on the kitchen floor. Not because she fell deliberately the way Henry had sat down in the main room 2 weeks ago when it was over, just needing to be closer to the ground, needing something solid under her. She sat down with Ruth in her lap and looked at the floorboards and breathed. Maria moved to her immediately, crouching down, a hand on her back. "You all right?" Maria asked. Emily looked up. Her eyes were bright. "Are we going to stay here?" she asked. "Really stay, not just for a while." Maria looked at Samuel over the top of Emily's head. Samuel looked back at her, and something passed between the 2 of them that Clara was old enough to notice and smart enough not to say anything about. "Really stay," Maria said firmly. "This is your home." Emily looked at her for a long moment. Then she said very quietly, the word dropping into the room like a stone into still water, "Mama." She said it like she hadn't entirely meant to, like it had been waiting behind her teeth for days and had finally come out on its own. She said it, and then her eyes went wide like she was expecting to be corrected. Maria's face did something complicated and beautiful. She sat down on the floor next to Emily, which she seemed to do as naturally as breathing, and she put both arms around the little girl and held her. "Yes," Maria said into Emily's hair. "Yes, baby. That's right." Henry looked at Clara. Clara looked at Henry. He had the bright, dangerous look around his eyes that meant he was going to start crying in approximately 30 seconds if someone didn't say something normal. "I'm hungry," Clara said. Henry laughed instead of crying. It came out a little broken at the edges, but it was real, and Samuel looked at her with the expression she was beginning to think of as the one he saved specifically for moments when she did something that surprised him, and Clara looked at the ceiling and pretended she hadn't done it on purpose. Judge Calhoun arrived Friday at noon, and he was a different man than the one who'd come riding in 2 weeks ago in the gray of the morning, with a tired horse and an impatient expression. He came in the daylight, and he accepted Maria's coffee, and he sat at the table and spread his papers out and went through each one with the methodical care of a man who understood that the details of a document like this one would matter to the people sitting across from him for the rest of their lives. Permanent guardianship of Clara Ann Calloway, age 8, of Emily Ruth Calloway, age 6, of James Henry Calloway, age 5, granted to Samuel Elias Holt of the Double H Ranch, Laramie County, Wyoming Territory. The Oregon land deed, held in trust by the court, divided equally among the 3 children upon each reaching the age of majority. Henry said, "What's majority in 21?" the judge said. "That's forever from now." "It is," the judge agreed. "But it will be there when you get to it." Samuel signed. The judge witnessed. Maria witnessed. Cooper, who had ridden back out at Samuel's request, because Samuel said a man who rode out at night to find children on a trail deserved to be in the room when it came right, signed as a second witness and put his hat back on and said, "Well, that's done proper," in the tone of a man who found genuine satisfaction in a thing done proper. It was over. 16 days after Martha Blake had thrown a loaf of bread from a moving wagon into the Wyoming dark, it was legally, permanently, irrevocably over. Clara expected to feel something enormous. Some wave of the kind of feeling that songs were written about, some sea change in the way the air tasted or the light fell. Instead, she felt something quieter and stranger, and she decided better a simple solid settling, like a foundation going into ground that had finally been dug deep enough. Not the end of something. The beginning of something that was going to last. Judge Calhoun was packing his papers when the sound of a horse came through the front window. One horse alone, coming slow. Samuel's hand moved toward his hip before he caught himself and stilled it, and he looked at Clara, and she looked at him, and they both stood at the same moment and went to the door. Martha Blake was at the gate. Not through it, she'd stopped her horse at the gate post and sat there, and she was not the woman who had stood in this yard 2 weeks ago with her lawyer and her forged document and her cold calculation. She looked smaller. Clara wasn't sure if it was the daylight or the 2 weeks or something that had happened inside her, but she looked like less of herself than before. Samuel stepped off the porch. Clara moved to follow him, and he turned and looked at her. "Stay here," he said. "No," she said. Exact same word Emily had used 2 weeks ago in the bedroom doorway, same tone, same chin. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once, and they walked to the gate together. Martha looked at Samuel first. Then she looked at Clara. She had the look of a woman who had rehearsed something and was now discovering that rehearsal hadn't been enough. "I'm not here to fight," she said. "All right," Samuel said. She stopped. She looked at her hands on the reins. "I want you to know that whatever you think of me, James, your father." She was looking at Clara now. "He loved you, all three of you. He talked about you every day. He was a good man, and he deserved better children than—" She stopped again, shook her head slightly. "He deserved better from me than what I gave him, or them." The wind moved through the grass. Nobody spoke. "I know that don't fix anything," Martha said. "No," Clara said. "It doesn't." Martha nodded. "I know." She looked at Samuel. "The court is going to do what it's going to do. I'm not going to fight it. She reached into her coat and produced a small folded paper and held it out over the gate. "James wrote that. Before he was too sick. Before he couldn't hold the pen. He wrote it, and he gave it to me, and he told me to give it to Clara someday. He said she'd be ready for it someday." She paused. "I don't know why I held on to it this long. I don't know why I didn't burn it." She left the paper held out over the gate. "Maybe I wasn't all the way gone yet. I don't know." Samuel took the paper and handed it to Clara without opening it. Clara held it. It was folded into a small square, soft at the creases from being carried a long time. Her name was written on the outside in her father's handwriting, which she would have recognized anywhere, and the sight of it hit her somewhere behind her sternum with a force that was not like pain and was not like anything else she had a name for. Martha looked at her for a moment longer. Then she turned her horse and rode back toward the main road and did not look back, and that was the last time Clara Calloway ever saw Martha Blake. She stood at the gate for a long time, holding the letter. Samuel stood beside her and said nothing, because he understood she was learning when nothing was the right thing. Finally, she unfolded it. Her father's handwriting was unsteady. She could see the effort in every letter. The determination of a man writing through hands that were beginning to fail him. It was short. He had not had the strength for long. She read it once to herself. Then she looked up at the sky, the enormous Wyoming sky, blue and clear and going on forever, and she read it aloud for Henry and Emily, who had come up behind her at some point, without her hearing them, and for Samuel, who had earned the right to hear anything James Calloway had left behind for his children. "Clara, You are the bravest person I know, and I have known some brave people in my time. I need you to do something for me. I need you to let someone love you. I know you. I know how you hold yourself apart when you're scared. I know you keep watch when you ought to be sleeping. Let someone stand the watch for you sometimes. Let someone be brave for you. You have earned that. You all three have. Find the people who choose you. Choose them back. That's the whole of it. That's all I know. I love you more than Wyoming is wide. Papa. Nobody spoke. Henry made the sound he'd been holding back for 16 days. The real one. The one from the bottom of him. And this time nobody said anything normal to stop it, because it didn't need stopping. He cried the way people cry when they are finally safe enough to. Great shaking sobs that he didn't try to quiet, and Samuel crouched down and put both arms around him and held on. And Henry grabbed the front of Samuel's shirt in both fists and buried his face in it. Emily was crying quietly the way she always cried, with Ruth pressed to her face and Maria's arms around her from behind. Clara folded her father's letter carefully along its original creases and held it against her chest and looked at the sky and let the tears come without trying to manage them. Because her father had asked her to let someone stand the watch, and someone was standing it, and she could afford to come apart for 60 seconds in the daylight in Wyoming in the company of people who had chosen her. 60 seconds. Then she put the letter in her pocket close to her heart, where it would stay for the rest of her life. That evening after supper, after Henry had fallen asleep in his chair at the table, and Samuel had carried him to bed, and Emily had gone to say goodnight to Duchess through the stable door with Maria walking alongside her, Clara sat on the porch steps and listened to the prairie settle into night, and thought about her father's words. Find the people who choose you. Choose them back. She heard the front door, and then Samuel sat on the step beside her, not above her this time, beside her equal ground, and she understood that was intentional. She left something after all, he said. Papa did. She just carried it. Clara looked at the first stars coming out. He knew I'd need it. He always knew what I'd need before I did. Smart man. The best man I ever knew. She paused. Henry said that on the first night. I remember. She looked at him sideways. Are you going to ask Maria to marry you? Samuel was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. That's a direct question. You were going to anyway. I can see it when you look at her. It's the same way Papa looked at Mama before she got sick. She looked back at the stars. You should do it in front of us. We're part of it. He was quiet again. Then he said, You'd be all right with that, with Maria being... She already is, Clara said simply. She sat on the floor. Adults who will sit on the floor for you, that's the whole test. Papa taught me that too. Something in Samuel Holt's chest moved in a way it hadn't moved in 4 years. He didn't speak for a moment, because some things don't need words immediately, because some things are better held for a second before you put language on them. Then he said, All right, in front of you. He did it the next morning at the breakfast table with all 3 children watching, and Henry barely containing himself because Clara had told him it was coming and sworn him to secrecy, and the secrecy had lasted approximately 14 hours, which was a personal record for him. Samuel put down his coffee cup and looked at Maria, and said her name the way he said it, when he meant something by it, not household business, not a question, just her name, full and serious. Maria looked at him. She already knew. Clara could see it. Maria had known since before Clara knew, probably. She set down her spoon. I am not good at speeches, Samuel said. You know that. I do, Maria said. And you know this ranch, and you know me, and you know these children better than most people know anything. He held her gaze. I'm asking you to stay, not as the housekeeper, as my wife, as their... He glanced at the children. Whatever they want to call you. Emily said Mama. Immediately. No hesitation. Henry said same. Clara looked at Maria. Maria was looking at her because Maria understood the way she always understood that Clara was the one whose answer mattered most to ask for last. Yes, Clara said. Please say yes. Maria looked at Samuel. Her eyes were bright, and her chin was steady, and she was the most composed person Clara had ever seen in a moment that called for everything but composure. "You could have led with the please," she said. "It's very effective." Samuel almost smiled. "Is that a yes?" "That," Maria said, "is absolutely a yes." Henry threw both arms up and knocked his biscuit off the table, and nobody cared, and the kitchen of the Double H Ranch was full of noise and warmth, and the particular joy that doesn't come from nothing going wrong, but from something going irrevocably right, the kind that settles into walls and floors and stays. Clara Calloway had been thrown off a moving wagon into the dark, with nothing but torn hands and a brother and sister, and the stubbornness her father had built into her bone deep. She had walked 2 hours across the Wyoming prairie in the cold, and she had stood up straight in front of a judge and a lawyer, and the woman who had tried to erase her, and she had held her ground. She had found the people who chose her. She had chosen them back. And she was 8 years old and the daughter of the best man she ever knew, and the sister of Henry and Emily, and the child of a ranch that stretched 4,000 acres under the biggest sky in the world, and nobody, no legal document, no cold calculation, no woman in a wagon driving away into the dark was ever going to take that from her again. Some things, once they are real, stay real. Some choices, once they are made hold. This family was one of them, and it would hold for the rest of their lives.